Hey everyone, welcome to BL's Story of Love. If you're here for the first time, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications. Get comfortable, put on your headphones, take a sip of tea. The city had been pressing on him since early morning, like always. But today Lev felt its weight especially clearly. The narrow rental apartment on the top, almost attic floor seemed even smaller than usual. Dampness seeped from the ceiling. In the bathroom, water dripped in a thin, nervous rhythm. Behind the paper-thin wall, someone was drilling into concrete again and swearing in broken local slang, mixing foreign words with familiar curses. Lev woke up before his alarm to a sound he already knew by heart. In the next room, a blanket rustled softly, small feet slid across the sheet, and the child turned onto his other side. The boy was still asleep, hugging a misshapen cheap plush lion. The toy had long lost its shape and brightness, but in their washed-out gray morning, it was the only warm spot of color, a dull yellow piece of somebody else's sun in someone else's apartment. For a while, Lev just lay there and listened. The neighbors upstairs moving around, getting ready for their early shift. The dull thump of the elevator stopping on their floor. The alarm on his phone starting to whine and then dying out as he stopped it before it could spiral into a full breakdown. Nothing in these sounds was new, but today every one of them felt like another reminder. Time was almost gone. The place smelled of damp wallpaper, cheap floor cleaner, and fatigue. Lev had long since stopped noticing the smell of fear, his own fear, the same way you stop noticing your own skin. It was hammered into the walls, into his clothes, into every chipped mug in the kitchen. Fear of waking up one day and finding that letter he'd been dreading for months lying under the door. Today, the letter wasn't under the door. It was on the kitchen table, and the red stamp of the management company stared at Lev like an unblinking eye. Yesterday, he hadn't dared open it in front of the child. He'd simply taken it from the postman, nodded, mumbled a mechanical "thanks," and shoved it into the stack of unpaid bills. Now there was no way around it. He got up, trying not to make the old linoleum creak, walked into the kitchen and flicked on the weak yellow light under the cupboard. The letter lay exactly in the center of the table, as if someone had placed it there on purpose so it couldn't be ignored. The red ink of the stamp had bled slightly into the paper. The envelope felt rough and cheap under his fingers, almost abrasive. He opened it carefully, as if not to tear the text, even though he understood perfectly well. This was not something he'd want to keep. Inside was exactly what he'd expected. Standard phrases about overdue payments, about violation of contract terms, about the need to pay off the debt within the specified period, words about final notice, and measures that will be taken if payment is not received again. Lines printed hundreds of times for hundreds of apartments just like his, but for him it wasn't standard. For him, this was a thin but very real line between a roof over their heads and a cot in a temporary shelter. At the bottom, slightly off-center, stood the electronic signature, a cold, distant alpha name that owned this whole building and at least a dozen more like it. Lev had never seen the man in person, but he had hated that name for a long time. It had no soft sounds in it, just hard consonants that seemed designed to cut the ear. The day before, he had heard that voice. Not the face, not the eyes, just the voice. And that was more than enough to turn his usual impulse to tear the letter up into a deeper, darker wish, to burn the whole house down. He remembered the cramped office of the building manager, smelling of cheap coffee and tired people. A glass divider separated the clients from the desk where a beta manager sat, faded eyes, neatly styled hair barely hiding the first gray strands. Lev sat opposite her, gripping his folder of receipts and certificates like a talisman. He spoke calmly and very politely, because experience had taught him. Shouting never helps. He explained that the delay was temporary, that he wasn't refusing to pay, that he was working double shifts, that he just needed a little more time. His words hit the glass and slid down it like condensation. The beta sighed, glanced at her monitor, at the total, at the red numbers. Then she dialed an internal extension and turned on the speakerphone without even thinking to lower the volume. Or maybe she did think, and decided it was better this way. The voice on the other end was low and merciless. It didn't care about certificates, payment plans, or double shifts. It talked about numbers. Clear, fast, with the tired precision of someone who had been doing the same thing for too many years. There wasn't a trace of interest in the people behind those numbers, only in the sums, the percentages, the deadlines. The voice reminded her that the building needed to be cleared of problem tenants, that an Omega with a child was a potential complaint, a potential inspection, a potential headache, that it was easier to cross one apartment off the list now than to deal with social services, lawyers, and bad press later. He said it casually, like discussing replacement of old radiators. There were no direct threats in those phrases. Nobody said throw them out on the street. But the air in that office vibrated with that promise all the same. Lev sat and listened as an unknown alpha, who had never seen him or his child, calmly and neatly explained why it was necessary to get rid of them like a line in a spreadsheet. The manager hung up and repeated the same words in a softer tone, with human intonations and apologetic eyes. Lev nodded, took his folder, and walked out, feeling the hallway walls pressing down on his shoulders. From that day on, the name on those letters had a sound attached to it. Cold, heavy, impersonal. Coming home that evening, he spent a long time standing in the doorway of the small bedroom, leaning his shoulder against the frame. His son was asleep on the folding sofa, legs tucked in, nose buried in an old blanket. His cheeks were warm, his hair stuck together in cowlicks, his eyelashes trembled slightly in his sleep. Lev watched him and counted days. How many were left before the final date on the letter? How many shifts he'd have to work to cover at least half the debt? How many hours on his feet his body could still take? The 24-hour diner was the only thing keeping a steady income flowing. Oil splattering on the hot surface, the smell of burnt meat, drunk customers yelling across the counter, late-night fights near the bar. All of that had become normal for him. He had learned to sleep in the daytime for 2 or 3 hours at a time, to recognize by footsteps alone who was coming to order and who was coming to pick a fight, to smile when all he wanted to do was collapse. But that job barely covered food, diapers, utilities, and his scent blockers. Blockers were their own line in the budget. Without them, he wouldn't even have been hired for the night shifts. For employers, a beta was safer, more predictable, easier. And Omega meant extra questions, prejudice, sometimes outright harassment. Every small bottle of pills cost him almost half a day's work. He bought them anyway, choosing cheaper groceries and cutting out anything that wasn't strictly necessary. Any delay in pay turned his life into a slow, sticky fall, like the floor itself was sliding out from under his feet. Physically, he had already lived through the worst. Pregnancy alone, with nobody to hold his hand, with family doctors sighing in irritation every time they saw his name on the chart, giving birth in an overfilled maternity ward that left him in the corridor until the very last moment, because they had no rooms. Recovery on cheap medication that he rationed drop by drop to last him through the full course. Back then, it had seemed to him that this was rock bottom. Now, with a living child next to him, to his right in the crib, and to his left in every thought, fear had changed shape. Any letter with a red stamp now meant danger not only to him. It was a reminder that this small person could lose not just their room, but their sense of safety. He walked over to the window and lifted the blind a little. From the 5th floor, the view opened onto a gray courtyard choked with cars. The playground, once bright and colorful, now looked worn and tired. The swing creaked. The sandbox had turned into a muddy pit with cigarette butts instead of toys. Couples trudged home from night shifts, arguing by the parking lot. An elderly beta neighbor with a cane crossed the yard, slowly, stubbornly keeping his rhythm. For a second, Lev pictured himself and his son going down those stairs with a suitcase or a couple of bags. And then what? The intake center, friends who barely had enough for themselves. The train station, where people with nowhere to go tried to sleep sitting up. The picture was so vivid that he instinctively leaned on the windowsill, as if his balance truly depended on it. Somewhere behind the wall, someone turned on the TV. A cheerful host announced the growth of the property market, new housing projects, how the city is changing for the better. Lev let out a short, joyless breath of laughter. The city's progress was being built right on top of people like him. His son woke up and called out to him quietly, and Lev pulled away from the window. The child's room smelled warm, with a hint of milk. The boy, still too small for his age, rubbed his eyes with his fists and reached out toward him. Lev picked him up, breathed in his simple, clean home smell, and felt something shift inside. Fear was no longer only about the future. It was also about what kind of father he was going to be in that future. He made them a modest breakfast. Heated up leftover porridge, spread a thin layer of cheap paste on bread, boiled water for instant coffee. His son ate happily, splashing food everywhere. And for a few minutes, Lev let himself enjoy the illusion of normal life. He talked to him in a half-whisper about the morning, about how today they would draw pictures before Dad left for his shift, how the lady from the 5th floor would come sit with him later. The boy listened with serious eyes, the lion clutched in one hand. Back on the kitchen table, the letter lay in its new place, now next to the child's cup. The contrast hurt his eyes, a white sheet with black text and a red stamp. Next to it, a plastic cup with a little car printed on it and sticky juice traces on the rim. That frame held his entire life. Toward evening, when the city started to light its concrete with neon, the apartment slipped into its usual half-darkness. Lev put his son down for a daytime nap to at least partially make up for his absence at night. He sat on the edge of the sofa until the child's breathing turned slow and even. Then he went back to the kitchen, opened his old laptop that should have been scrapped years ago, and waited for it to reluctantly wake up. Job listing sites loaded slowly. Pages froze, then jerked. But that delay gave him a strange, precious thing, a little extra time to think. His fingers moved over the touchpad automatically, scrolling down endless lines: cashier, order picker, night loader, call center operator. Almost everywhere was that one word he could no longer afford: work with no accommodation. He scrolled through dozens of ads until his eyes burned from the strain. His attention caught only on those rare lines that mentioned housing, hot meals, a fixed salary. Nannies, caregivers, live-in house staff, workers in retirement homes, teaching assistants. Almost everywhere they wanted spotless health checks, references, and often, explicitly, a beta status. He caught himself reading the same paragraph over and over, not even noticing time passing. Inside, a simple, cruel thought was slowly taking shape. They needed to get out of here before someone physically threw them out, not wait until someone else's signature decided everything for them, but try, at least once, to change the scenery on his own terms. His fear of change crashed against his fear of staying where he was. A new place, a new boss, new rules. All of that terrified him almost as much as the thought of ending up on the street. But here, in this narrow apartment with peeling walls and that letter on the table, he had run out of time. He closed his eyes for a moment and let himself whisper a small, almost childish thought: why now? Of course, there was no answer, just the trembling line of the deadline in the letter, and the quiet murmur of strangers behind the wall humming along to his decisions. Somewhere inside him, almost imperceptibly, a point of no return began to form. For now, it was just a stubborn, quiet desire to take at least one step toward the future himself, instead of waiting to be kicked into it. The endless list of jobs kept unrolling on the screen like a gray sheet. Cashier, courier, night operator, warehouse picker, dispatcher. In almost every ad, the same phrase repeated: full-time shifts, no distractions, no children allowed at work. Lev scrolled through the options, feeling that familiar tightening in his chest, like someone had pulled a belt too tight under his ribs. He sat at the rickety kitchen table, propping his cheek on his hand, and glanced every now and then at the open bedroom door. In the dim light, he could see his son's small figure on the sofa, breathing quietly. Every new no in those listings echoed in his head not as "doesn't fit," but as "won't survive." He was already about to close the site and resign himself to trying to grab extra hours at the diner when his eye caught a headline in bold. The ad stood out from the others from the very first words. Not "staff wanted," not "worker required," but a sentence that sounded almost like the beginning of a different life. A well-known businessman, a single father of quadruplets, is looking for a live-in caregiver. Lev reread that line, afraid he'd misunderstood. Well-known businessman. Single father. Quadruplets. Live-in. Further down was a list of conditions that made his tired brain, for a second, try to form something like hope. A separate room in the house. Meals included. A salary that, compared to what he had now, looked almost solid. and that vague phrase, "must be ready for a non-standard work schedule," which could mean anything, from night terrors and bedwetting to the father disappearing on sudden trips. The list of requirements was as long as a holiday shopping receipt: teaching degree or medical background, verified experience working with children, mental health clearance, substance abuse clearance, full medical check, written references from previous employers. And at the very end, that familiar line: preference given to beta candidates. Lev let go of the mouse and closed his eyes for a moment. Those 3 words, preference to betas, didn't sting because they were surprising, but because they were painfully predictable. That was how it worked almost everywhere. Omegas weren't trusted with jobs like this. Too many biological risks, too many stereotypes, too many other people's fantasies where there should have been nothing but work. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the old fridge creak and hum, somewhere near the end of its life. In his head, a simple but important fork in the road slowly formed. Stay here. Live with his son in a half-ruined apartment where every letter with a red stamp could be the last straw, or take the risk and try to step into someone else's house, hiding the one fact that most employers saw as a problem before anything else. His Omega status had been buried under layers of scent blockers and a carefully built legend for a long time now. A beta nurse he knew, with gentle hands and tired eyes, had once helped him get his lab results in order, for money and silence. Ever since, all his paperwork listed him as beta. Not the strongest, not exactly healthy, but neutral. Safe. He had trained himself to be in control of his body as if his life depended on it, because it did. He took his blockers on schedule. Avoided situations where his scent could betray him. Stayed away from crowds of alphas and from hot, stuffy, enclosed spaces with strangers. At the cafe, he'd swap shifts if he smelled too many heavy alpha scents in the hall. Being an Omega in his position meant pretending to be whoever made survival easier. He leaned closer to the screen and scrolled down to the end of the ad again. In fine print was the name of the agency handling the hiring. A phone number, a website, and the familiar promise: strict confidentiality, special requirements for candidates. He could almost hear his inner skeptic. Who would choose you? You, with your overdue bills, borrowed kids' clothes, and patched medical record. But next to that voice, another one had appeared. Softer, but clearer. If you don't even try, you'll sit here to the very end, waiting for someone to drag you out along with the furniture. He placed his hands on the keyboard and started working on his resume. The old file on the laptop was useless now. It belonged to another life. He rewrote everything. Under work experience, he carefully added the months he had spent helping in the cafe's small kids' corner, back when he was still pregnant, and hiding it under a loose uniform. He wrote a couple of lines about younger cousins he'd watched when he still lived with his family. Mentioned volunteer shifts at children's centers he'd done before his son was born. He did not write a single word about his own child. That was too risky. A single Omega father with a kid raised too many questions. A beta with childcare experience was just another candidate. Choosing a photo took longer than it should have. The old pictures were from his before life. Too much of the past in his eyes. The recent ones were full of fatigue, dark circles under his eyes, and the bad lighting of their kitchen. In the end, Lev picked a neutral shot somebody had snapped at the cafe counter. He was in a clean uniform, hair tied back, face calm. On that photo, he looked exactly how he wanted to be seen. Neat, low-key, dependable. He wrote the cover letter several times, wiping out extra emotion each time. No, please, I'm begging you, or this is my only chance. He left only the facts: age, beta status according to documents, work experience, readiness to live in, no bad habits. At the very end, he added one short line, that he was not afraid of difficult children or messy situations. That wasn't something he'd read in a book. That was something he had earned with his own sleepless nights. He pressed send and stared at the screen. Nothing changed, no fireworks, no instant replies. Just a small line. Email sent successfully. Life in the apartment stayed the same. The tap still dripped. Somebody still cursed behind the wall. His son still breathed quietly in the next room. The call from the agency came the next evening when Lev was trying to put the boy down for a nap before his night shift. The number was unfamiliar, a landline. He slipped quietly into the kitchen, pulling the door to the bedroom almost closed, and answered. The conversation was formal but tense. The beta voice on the other end wasn't cold or warm, just experienced and focused. They clarified details from his resume, asked about how he handled stressful situations, what he would do if a child got sick in the middle of the night, how he felt about strict schedules and about the house being far outside the city. Lev answered honestly within the limits of his legend. He emphasized his night work experience, that he didn't panic when a child cried, that he could run a household without dumping everything on the owner. He said he knew how to keep distance, not to intrude on the family, to respect private space. The word omega didn't appear, not in his speech, not in their questions. At one point they asked him to describe his strongest side in a single sentence. He hesitated, then said what he truly believed. He didn't give up after the first try. Even when he was scared, even when nobody believed in him, the woman on the other end paused for a second, then, probably, gave a small nod he couldn't see and asked him to send scans of his medical clearances and references. He assembled his medical file from scraps of different clinics, carefully cleaning out anything that could expose his status and leaving only neutral notes in the final line. No restrictions for work. Days passed. The apartment shrank again, turning back into a box where life fit between the crib, the stove, and the table with the laptop. Lev was already starting to convince himself that the agency had found someone better. Someone without debt, without a child, with a real teaching degree. Then his phone rang again. This time the voice was more official, with a hint of something like satisfaction underneath. The kind you hear when a rare puzzle piece finally clicks into place. His resume had been approved for the next stage. The client wanted to meet him in person at the agency office. They gave him the address, date, time. Asked him to bring original documents, copies of all certificates, and be ready for additional questions. He came to the office in clothes that once counted as dressy for him. A neat shirt bought long ago, buttoned up to his throat. Clean but slightly faded dress pants. He left his old jacket with the stubborn stain in the cloakroom. The hallway smelled of coffee from a vending machine and disinfectant. The walls were painted in a neutral pastel tone, decorated with framed thank you letters and photos of smiling nannies with children. A beta receptionist with perfect nails and a cool gaze led him to a meeting room. It was too bright and too clean, and Lev felt every breath like it was being recorded. The interview was conducted by another beta, a middle-aged man who had clearly been in this business long enough to read people in the first 3 minutes. They talked for a long time. Lev went over his experience again, this time in detail, answered follow-up questions, tried not to fidget with the edge of the folder on his knees. They asked how he resolved conflicts between children, how he reacted to screaming, what he would do if an adult crossed a child's boundaries. At that last question, he froze for a moment, then answered firmly. Something flickered in the interviewer's eyes, maybe respect. The administrator was clearly assessing more than just his answers. She watched how he sat, how he held eye contact, how he reacted to sudden turns in the conversation. Lev felt like he was under an X-ray. Every tiny gesture seemed too loud. At the end, they told him his resume would be passed directly to the client. They casually mentioned that the house was outside the city, on a high hill next to a line of forest. They never said the owner's name, just underlined that he was a major alpha businessman with a reputation for not tolerating weakness and valuing discipline. There was a warning in that tone. It will not be easy there. He took the same route home along sand-dusted sidewalks, feeling everything inside him rattling like loose parts in an old machine. In the apartment, he took off his jacket, leaned his back against the door, and just breathed for a minute. Then went to the child. His son greeted him with a wide grin and a question that sounded too adult for such a small boy. "Dad, are you tired?" Lev pulled him close, inhaled his warm, familiar scent, and felt fear, hope, and exhaustion collide in his chest. 2 very real pictures fought for space in his mind. The first, a night in an intake center where the lights never go fully off. Strangers walking past their bunks. His child unable to sleep because of other people's voices. The 2 of them in line for a bed with their entire life packed into 2 bags. The second, a strange house far from the city, a strict alpha owner, 4 small children to watch day and night. A relentless schedule, someone else's rules. Constant tension, waiting for the moment his secret finally slipped out. Neither option was safe, but only one of them gave even a small chance of not ending up on the street. The next day, closer to noon, his phone vibrated again. The agency manager's voice was businesslike, but underneath Lev caught that slight edge of excitement, the sound of a rare match. He was invited to the final interview at the client's house. The road to the house on the hill turned out longer than it looked on the map.
The minibus left the gray city behind, its wheels chewing over broken asphalt, and the scenery outside the window slowly started to change. Graffiti-covered walls, crumbling facades, and sagging balconies gave way to smooth fences, fresh plaster, and carefully trimmed lawns. Lev sat by the window, his fingers locked around the folder in his lap, feeling his decision sway inside him with every turn. He had left his son with the elderly beta neighbor on the first floor, the one who watched him from time to time for a small fee.
He'd lied again, saying he was going to a regular interview not far away. In truth, the distance between their world and the house on the hill couldn't be measured in kilometers. The minibus dropped him off at a stop by the highway. From there he had to walk toward the tall iron fence visible in the distance. The closer he came, the clearer it became that this was not just a private home, it was a fortress disguised as a modern villa, a high fence with built-in cameras, the sleek line of a gate that smelled of metal and money. Lev stopped for a second to steady his breathing. "You're not walking back now," his inner voice said dryly. He pressed the intercom button and felt something in his chest flinch, like his heart wanted to hide. The house did not respond right away. First, the security system did. A short electronic tone, a camera turning with a quiet mechanical click, a crackle in the speaker, a polite but impersonal voice asked for his name and the purpose of his visit. Lev introduced himself, mentioned the agency, and a minute later the heavy gate slid open with a soft metallic rustle. Inside, the quiet was unnatural. No shouting, no running kids in the yard, no clatter of bottles or loud music. A narrow path led upward to the house between perfectly cut bushes. The wind stirred the tops of tall trees, but even that sound seemed restrained, softened. Several cars stood in the parking area, each worth far more than everything in his rented apartment put together. The asphalt was smooth, without a single pothole. Everything looked polished, scrubbed, almost sterile. Lev walked up the path, feeling each step too clearly. The soles of his cheap shoes seemed too loud against the gravel. His freshly washed jacket still felt out of place here. The house rose above the hill in a confident line of glass, concrete, and wood. No ornate columns, no plaster flowers, just modern, expensive, and absolutely sure of its right to be here. A security guard, a beta with sharp, attentive eyes, met him by the wide front steps. He nodded and led Lev inside. The air changed almost physically once they crossed the threshold. The smell of expensive wood and glass cleaner, coffee, someone's perfume, and something else, the subtle presence of a well-designed security system. No visible guards in the corners, no barking orders. But under each smooth surface, Lev sensed a level of control he hadn't seen before. The spacious hall overwhelmed with its scale. The ceiling soared away upward, soft light poured from hidden fixtures. The stone floor was cool through his soles. Paintings hung on the walls, too expensive to be simple decoration, too correct to feel like a personal choice. Lev caught himself thinking that the whole place looked like a showroom, perfectly arranged for other people's eyes. Only one layer didn't fit this polished picture. Somewhere beyond one of the doors, sounds blended and spilled out into the quiet hall. Light tapping of small feet on parquet, the scrape of plastic toys dragged across the floor. High chiming laughter, a quick burst of crying, almost immediately drowned out by something louder. The kind of children's noise you could not hide, even in the most expensive house. The housekeeper met him, a beta woman in a flawlessly tailored suit. Her voice held not a drop of softness, only polished courtesy of someone who kept the entire place running and had no intention of wasting time. She looked him over from head to toe. Clothes, posture, folder, even the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. From her short remark about the value of punctuality, Lev realized the test had started before he'd even opened his mouth. They spoke in a small sitting room that still managed to feel enormous. Soft sofas, a low table. Big windows looking out on the garden. Somewhere deeper in the house, the children's voices continued to tear tiny holes in the formal atmosphere. The housekeeper outlined the rules without glancing at notes. The quadruplets schedule, the nanny's duties, confidentiality requirements. No outsiders in the house, no personal guests. Minimal days off to be agreed on in advance. Complete obedience to the house rules and to the owner. The alpha's last name slid between the lines, but Lev had already seen it earlier that morning on the brass plaque at the gate, and something twisted inside him. It was the same name printed at the bottom of his eviction notice. The same man who, through the management company, had labeled him a problem tenant. He pretended not to notice the coincidence. He allowed himself only a brief internal deal with it later and pushed that thought somewhere far into the back of his mind. They took him upstairs. The staircase was wide, with smooth railings perfect for kids to slide down if nobody stopped them. On the second floor, the air changed again, this time to a warm chaos of laundry detergent, baby lotion, plastic toys, and crumbs of cookies. The sound grew stronger. Now he could distinguish individual voices, one higher, sharper, another raspier, a cautious one. A whiny one. The door to the nursery opened suddenly. The housekeeper started to say something, but her words dissolved in the wave that crashed out of the room. The quadruplets stormed into the hallway like a tiny tornado. 4 very similar faces, each with its own shade of eyes and tilt of the chin. 2 already taller and lanky like saplings, 2 shorter and sturdier, like small solid balls. One child wore a t-shirt with little cars. Another had on a stretched-out sweater. A third was barefoot. The fourth had on 2 different socks. They stopped in front of Lev in a crooked line, studying the new adult with the direct, merciless curiosity only children have. There was no fear or delight in their looks. Just a clear, silent question. Will this one stay or vanish like the others before him? Lev knew there had already been several nannies. The agency had mentioned it briefly, with no detail, but now he could practically hear that history in the air. The tiredness of the staff, forced to get used to new people over and over, the distrust of kids raised to expect adults to leave, the hard rhythm of a house that refused to bend to someone else's weakness. One of the children, a girl or maybe a boy he didn't have time to tell, stepped forward and bluntly asked who he was. The voice rang clear and sure. Lev said his name and realized he was smiling. Not a forced, hire me smile, a real one. Inside, a quick thought flickered. 4 of them and just one of me. It was both terrifying and strangely calm. The housekeeper watched them interact, not stepping in. That was a test, too. Lev could feel her gaze like a spotlight. He crouched down so he'd be on their level and let them inspect him. One child reached for his shoelaces. Another took hold of his sleeve as if to see whether he would disappear if they pulled. The third kid's eyes went round when he noticed the old watch on Lev's wrist. The fourth silently walked around him in a full circle like a tiny security guard, then returned to the others. For a few minutes, the noise faded into the background. Lev asked simple questions: how old they were, what they liked, whether they had favorite toys. He listened to their answers, mentally noting who cut others off, who stayed quiet, who tried to be in charge. The quadruplets turned out not to be identical pieces from one set, but 4 separate worlds, all spinning around one shared axis, a strict schedule and a father who was absent in person but present in every rule. After this short introduction, the housekeeper asked him to stay with the children alone for a trial period of time. She left, closing the door behind her, and the silence in the hallway felt almost as heavy to Lev as the buzzing inside the room. The quadruplets exchanged glances as if they had received a secret signal and immediately scattered in 4 directions. One climbed up on the bed, another ran to the toys, a third grabbed Lev by the hand, demanding attention, and the fourth sat down in the corner with a book, pretending he didn't care at all. The room filled with chaotic movement. Lev felt panic rising inside. If they all started crying at the same time, he wouldn't cope. He remembered the nights when his own son cried from colic, and he paced the tiny kitchen, bumping his elbows against the walls. Back then, it was just him, a child in his arms, and the fear that the neighbors would call someone in authority. Here, the space was bigger. The children were 4 times as many, but the sense of being overwhelmed was exactly the same. He did the only thing he had really learned over the last years. He didn't try to control everything at once. First, he stopped the one who was already leaning too far over the bed rail. Then he turned to the child tugging on his sleeve and suggested they get a game down from the top shelf together. Within a couple of minutes, two of the kids were already sitting on the rug arguing over blocks. The third he quietly invited to help him count the toy cars, turning extra energy into a task. To the fourth, the one sitting with the book, he simply said that if he wanted, he could later show Lev his favorite place in the house. Little by little, the noise stopped being pure chaos and turned into a working background. The children came up to him one by one, checking whether he would respond when they needed him. Once someone burst into tears, somebody had snatched a toy away. Lev didn't raise his voice. He sat down next to them and calmly untangled the argument, splitting the toy with a simple timer rule. You play first, then you. Inside, he was nervous, but his hands moved automatically. When the housekeeper came back, the room was quiet as it can be with that many small people in it. Not perfect. Someone was still speaking too loudly. Someone was already frowning from tiredness. But the atmosphere was very different from the initial storm. Lev sat on the floor, leaning his back against the bed. The blocks on the rug were sorted by color. One child held a book and was reading the pictures with an impressively serious face. The housekeeper's gaze lingered on this scene longer than on any line in his resume. She made a note on her tablet, nodded once, and that nod clearly meant, "You passed the minimum test." They took him further through the house, showed him the room that would be his. It was close to the nursery, so at night he could reach the kids in a few seconds if something happened. The room was small but bright. White walls, a narrow bed, a small table, a built-in wardrobe, a window overlooking the garden. A separate little bathroom with a shower, scrubbed clean to a shine. After his own apartment, this kind of simplicity felt like luxury. No mold stains, no peeling paint, no neighbor's TV pounding through the wall. He ran his hand along the windowsill and caught himself thinking that here, at least, a child wouldn't be breathing damp air. He didn't see the owner of the house that day. Only heard firm, confident footsteps above him a few times. Once, a low voice giving a short order to one of the staff. Later, a phone call and clipped businesslike phrases filled with the habit of solving problems quickly and without sentiment. The alpha existed in the house like a shadow, a vertical line of power running through all the floors, not needing direct contact. And in some ways that was more unsettling than if he had simply come down and looked Lev in the eye. That evening, on the way back in the minibus, Lev watched his hands. He could still feel the weight of little fingers on them, grabbing his sleeve, his wrist, his shoelace. The image of the nanny's room, the garden outside the window, the restored order among the toys they had tidied together, floated up in his mind again and again. The house on the hill was no longer an abstraction from an online listing. It had become a real place where they might move him and his child, a place with many rules, much external power, and a lot he would have to hide. But at the same time, a place where his son might, for the first time, have grass under the windows instead of a freezing stairwell. Only one question remained. Was he ready to live constantly under the invisible gaze of the alpha, whose cold name already stood under the red stamp on his eviction notice? And could he really keep part of himself hidden in a house where every detail seemed accounted for, where any mistake could cost not only his job, but their fragile little safety? The decision didn't fall on him like a sudden blow. It crept up slowly all night long, while the city outside the window sank into the muffled whisper of tires and the occasional shout from the yard. The narrow kitchen was lit only by a dim ceiling bulb. On the table lay 3 items that now defined his future: a small clear bottle of scent blockers, the preliminary contract from the agency, and the eviction warning with the red stamp. The blockers shimmered faintly, the liquid inside dull and cloudy. On the label, neat letters, an expiration date, a list of standard side effects. For Lev, those words translated into specific nights, when the pills knotted his stomach, when his heart skipped and stuttered, but his scent faded. Without them, he was an omega, a too visible target. With them, he turned into a gray figure, a convenient beta with good references. The preliminary contract looked flawless. In the status line, it said beta. Next to it, a phrase about a clean medical history and readiness to provide additional tests at the employer's request. Not a word about him ever being pregnant. No hint that, in the next room, A small child was sleeping, breathing quietly and unevenly, the way kids do when they've lived through too many winter colds in cold apartments. Lev ran his finger along the printed lines. The paper was smooth, rustling slightly. Cold. In the world of numbers and stamps, he really was an easy figure. A young man, beta, no family, no obligations. It was easy to build a legend around that. A neighbor who sometimes asked him to help with her nephews, first aid courses, a couple of volunteer shifts in a children's center, everything tidy, everything verifiable, everything designed to inspire trust. Beside it, lying partly over the overdue notice, was his real medical file, the one with marks he couldn't show anyone. Pregnancy, labor ward. Postpartum recovery, several visits marked as hormonal instability. Put next to the contract, they made two versions of the same life, two that had no right to meet. He looked up. From the kitchen doorway, he could see the child's bed pressed against the far wall. The boy was asleep, cheek resting on the battered plush lion. The blanket had slipped, a small foot stuck out from under it. Lev got up automatically, went over, pulled the blanket back up, and brushed his fingers lightly over the boy's forehead. Warm. Normal. Alive. You shouldn't have to live under threat of every letter. A thought flickered. You shouldn't wake up in fear at every knock on the door because someone got the wrong floor. He hadn't started hiding his status immediately after the birth. At first, there was a period when he still believed someone might care that he'd been left alone with a baby. That there might be employers for whom a single Omega father wasn't a stain, just a fact. Several attempts ended the same way. First, covert interest, then hints. Then, 2 direct offers to help with money if he helped in return. Once, an alpha customer tried to pin him to a wall in the diner kitchen, whispering that nobody will ever know. After that, he bought his first cheap bottle of blockers. Later, he started ordering better ones through people he knew. He found a nurse at the local clinic who understood that sometimes people needed to mute the truth just to survive. For an extra fee, she helped keep his Omega status off a few key charts. It wasn't heroic rebellion, just quiet, dirty adaptation. The house on the hill raised the stakes. It was one thing to hide your status from drunk customers in a night diner. Another to live under the same roof with an alpha who was used to receiving reports about everything around him. Here, mistakes didn't just mean losing shifts. Here, any crack in his legend could turn into a crack in the very foundation of their fragile existence, the scent he could manage. He planned his meals around the pills, took showers twice a day, wore clothes washed in neutral detergent, no perfumed products. No running hot and flustered through the house. No situations in which his body might decide it was time to let the Omega out. The documents were harder. He knew big employers often did their own checks. The agency assured him everything would be under control, that at this level, they trust our screening. But Lev had seen the way the housekeeper looked at people. That was the gaze of someone who'd convinced herself many times over not to trust someone else's paperwork. If she felt even a hint of inconsistency, she'd start digging. He sat back down at the table. The bottle of blockers stood across from him like a silent question. If he refused, the eviction notice would go through, followed by social services, temporary shelters with their strict rules, and no personal space. There would be no time there to pick and choose who watched his child. Any alpha on staff would be able to dictate their terms. If he agreed, he would live with constant fear of exposure. But between those two fears, there was one crucial difference. In the second option, he still had the illusion of some control. He could choose the doses, control the distance, plan ahead for dangerous situations. The decision finally took shape closer to dawn when the first cars began creaking outside and the heavy door of the building slammed shut. Lev picked up a pen. The preliminary contract lay in front of him, already filled in by the agency. All that was left was his signature. For a moment he stared at the empty line at the bottom. How many times in recent years had he signed papers that steered his life for him? NDAs, employment contracts, forms stating, "I have no complaints." Each time he'd felt another piece of his freedom dissolve into someone else's conditions. This time was different. It was still a compromise, still a lie, still a risk. But now he at least understood what he was agreeing to, and he was the one choosing it. Not his parents, not some rich alpha, not an agency rep. "You're not doing this for yourself," he reminded himself. "You're doing it for him." The ink flowed onto the paper in a clean, steady line. His signature was neat, just like he'd once been taught in school. The word beta above it didn't change, but something inside him flipped over. There was no going back to his old life. The question of his son hit him immediately after that signature. A live-in position didn't include personal extra circumstances in the form of a small child. He couldn't just bring the boy along by the hand and say, "He's with me, take us both." Any sympathy among the staff would crash against the owner's dry verdict. That's not what I'm paying for. The solution turned out cruel and simple. Leave his son with the neighbor, temporarily. The beta woman had lived in their building for years, alone, tired-faced, with endless TV series filling the silence of her flat. She had already helped him more than once, taking the boy when Lev had to rush to a last-minute shift or lie down with a fever. For a modest sum, she gladly kept the child with her, feeding him, turning on old cartoons, telling him stories about the good old days. Lev came to her early, before the city fully woke up. In his arms, the boy, clinging sleepily to his neck, fingers gripping his collar. In a bag, diapers, a couple of favorite toys, some food. Behind his back, a suitcase with his own things, a symbol that he too no longer belonged to those four damp walls. He spoke evenly, keeping to the facts. New job, live-in. He needed time to get settled. There would be money regularly, on time. One condition, no strangers in the apartment, no talking to anyone about the boy living there full-time. The fewer people knew, the safer it would be. The neighbor listened carefully, her brow furrowed. There was more genuine concern for him in her eyes than in any relatives he'd had. She didn't ask many questions. Just checked how soon he planned to take the boy to live with him. He answered honestly, "As soon as I can," even though he had no idea when that would be. When the door closed behind his child, the air in the stairwell felt strange, too empty. He stood for a few seconds, listening to the sounds behind the wall. First, the boy cried. Then the sobs turned into a thin, cranky whine. Then the neighbor's cheerful chatter drowned his voice out, dragging his attention toward cartoons and biscuits. Lev went down the stairs, each step echoing in his knees. Outside, the morning was cool. The smell of bread drifted from the nearby bakery. A tram hummed somewhere in the distance. Everything looked the same, but for him, the order of things had shifted. He took the first blocker right at the bus stop, washing it down with water from a flimsy plastic cup. The familiar wave of nausea rolled through him, followed by a dull heaviness in his head and that faint sensation that the world's smells had been turned down a notch. His brain noted it dryly. The mask is on. The ride to the agency took place in a half-empty minibus. The people around him smelled of early mornings, someone else's coffee, cheap deodorant. Nobody looked at him twice. To everyone else, he was just another young man with a suitcase. Good. The less attention, the better the mask worked. At the agency office, everything happened quickly. The receptionist checked his ID, compared the signature on the contract, had him refill a couple of forms, now that the client had officially approved him. One of them had a bold confidentiality clause. He agreed not to reveal any information about the house, the family, the internal rules. The penalty was a fine, and between the lines there was another threat, the loss of his name in the small, closed circle where good jobs were passed around. They handed him a thin folder with copies of his documents, an entry pass, instructions for arrival. The time the house expected him, a note that the main contract would be signed on site, directly with the owner. The morning he left for the house on the hill was crumpled and too sharp. He passed his neighbor's door again and stopped. Behind it, the TV murmured quietly, and for a moment, he heard his son's voice. Lev didn't ring the bell. If he saw the boy now, his legs might not carry him to the bus. At the bus stop, he stood with his suitcase and folder in hand. The wind tugged at his jacket. His eyes stung from lack of sleep. Inside, everything was tangled. Fear, guilt, hope. What am I doing? Flashed through his mind. Another thought followed immediately. What else could I have done? The bus pulled up with its usual squeak. The doors opened. He climbed in, paid the fare, and sank into a seat by the window. The city slipped past again, the same buildings, the same signs, the same puddles. Only now, every second, he felt that he wasn't just going to a shift. He was heading into a life he couldn't simply slam the door on and walk away from. He was going to a house he'd seen once. To 4 children, he'd barely kept under control for half an hour. to an owner he knew only from dry phrases and a single harsh voice on speakerphone. He was going with blockers in his blood, with a beta mask glued to his paperwork, and with the first real contract in a long time, one that could give him not only a job, but a chance to drag his son out of that failing building before someone else's signature turned into action. There was no road back anymore. The first days in the house on the hill blurred together like one long, never-ending shift. Lev barely distinguished morning from evening, only the change in sounds, the loud choir of children's voices, then their tired sniffling, then the rustle of the house at night as adults tried to finish everything that hadn't fit into daylight hours. The quadruplets lived like a small pack with its own view on schedules. The printed timetable from the housekeeper started confidently with, "Wake up at 7." In reality, every morning was different. Sometimes two of them were up before dawn, demanding water, attention, and a story about the monster in the closet. Sometimes all four clung to pillows and blankets, turning wake-up time into a small war for 5 more minutes. Lev quickly realized that fighting this head-on was pointless. He adapted. First, he woke the most sensitive child, the one who'd burst into tears fastest if he felt left out. Then he brought the rest in through play, through quiet stories, through promises that today the kitchen has a secret breakfast. No shouting. No sudden movements, just a persistent gentle pull of each child from sleep into the day. Breakfasts became their own universe. Each child had a favorite plate, a favorite mug color, a favorite spot at the table. If someone ended up in the wrong place, delicate work began, redirecting attention before the conflict exploded. Lev learned to set the table in advance in a way that minimized collisions. A few extra steps, a few extra seconds, and the morning passed not in screams but in loud, manageable noise. Walks were like small tactical missions. The garden was full of interesting things, old trees, bushes, paths, stones that begged to be climbed. Lev had to keep track of several things at once: who had already tried to climb too high, who grabbed every bug, who tired easily, who could run in circles until they dropped. He assigned roles, turned potentially dangerous spots into forbidden zones, and safe areas into secret bases. Sometimes it felt like being back in his old apartment where he'd had to fight for every free meter from cold and cramped walls. Only now there was plenty of space, and the task wasn't to stretch life out on a tiny floor plan, but to gather the scattered energy of 4 kids into something he could steer. The house slowly began to remember him. In the corridors, a new regular rhythm of steps appeared. In the kitchen, a different pattern of movement, more economical than the chefs, more confident than the temporary nannies. The smooth handrail on the staircase accepted his palm like part of a familiar mechanism. Even the electronic locks stopped feeling hostile. He learned to recognize, by sound, their short beeps that signaled someone coming or going. At first, the staff treated him with caution. Too many nannies had come and gone, leaving behind only the owner's displeasure and extra work. Lev saw the mix of fatigue and skepticism in their eyes. Another one. Let's see how long he lasts. He didn't try to befriend anyone, didn't complain, didn't pry into their lives. He just did his job. Over time, their attitude shifted. The maid started leaving a cup of tea on the edge of the counter when she knew he'd been putting the kids to bed late. The cook began asking his opinion on snacks if one of the children's appetite had changed. The guard at the gate quietly helped him out a couple of times when one of the boys insisted on pushing the button himself and froze in the middle of the passage. The alpha stayed in the background. His presence was always felt, even when he wasn't physically there. The schedule had lines like dinner with father and study time with parent. Those lines were often quietly crossed out to make the house align with reality. The housekeeper talked about unexpected meetings and urgent trips. Lev didn't ask questions. He heard the heavy front door open and close in the evenings, the office light turn on upstairs, the scent of an expensive cologne mixed with something sharp and metallic spreading through the house. Sometimes, while putting the children to bed, he caught fragments of tense conversations drifting down the stairwells. The alpha spoke on the phone briefly, sharply, without wasting words. There was force in that voice, the force of someone who pressed on situations until they yielded. But that voice was rarely heard in the nursery. More often, it was the housekeeper's clear instructions, Lev's quiet reassurances, and the endless children's noise. The blockers became part of his daily routine, as obligatory as brushing his teeth or checking that the nursery windows were shut. He set a discreet timer on his old watch so he wouldn't miss a dose. If he slipped even a few minutes, he felt anxiety rising. He couldn't afford a single leak. There were too many people in the house, too many eyes, and above all, one alpha to whom all reports flowed. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the house finally fell silent, Lev allowed himself one weakness. He would sit on the edge of his narrow bed, take out his phone, and reread the neighbor's messages. She wrote briefly. The boy ate well, was a bit cranky before sleep, asked where his dad was, but calmed down when she let him sleep with his toy. Lev read those lines and felt his chest squeeze with painful longing. The house on the hill gave him a roof, safety, a regular salary. But it didn't give him the one thing he had gone into this whole masquerade for, the right to be beside his own son. Sometimes he tried mentally to align those two worlds. Here, a spacious nursery, a garden view, a private doctor who could come at any hour. There, a cramped room, an old heater, a drawer full of cheap syrups, and a neighbor who, no matter how hard she tried, could never truly replace a parent. When he imagined his son among the quadruplets, the picture seemed almost unreal. One more child, one more voice, one more life to be responsible for. The house would not let him go. Every day brought new small tasks. Someone scraped a knee, someone fought over a toy, someone woke from a nightmare and refused to sleep alone. Lev caught himself walking the halls even in his dreams, checking whether the gate at the stairs was closed, whether any dangerous object was left out, whether the stove was off. By the middle of the second week, he suddenly realized he almost never thought about playing beta anymore. The mask had settled so tightly it became part of everyday life. His body reacted to the blockers as if they were normal. His thoughts focused not on what could expose him, but on how to get through each day so the children would fall asleep at night without too many tears. And still, the danger remained. Sometimes, in those rare short moments of silence, when the quadruplets were each focused on their own game, he listened to the house and heard things he had missed before in the rush. One afternoon, during quiet time, 3 of the children were already asleep, and the 4th was still tossing and turning, stubbornly telling himself he wasn't tired. The nursery door opened with a faint creak. A tall figure appeared in the doorway. Out of habit, Lev turned toward the window, so it looked like he hadn't noticed. The alpha walked in softly, almost soundless. He stopped beside one of the beds. The air in the room changed instantly, became denser, heavier. Lev heard him hold his breath, looking at the scattered toys and the tangled hair on the pillows. The silence hung like a curtain. The owner asked the housekeeper a few short questions. She stood in the doorway. Lev only caught fragments, routine, behavior, complaints. There was no tenderness in the alpha's voice, but that ice-cold indifference he'd heard through a speakerphone at the management office wasn't there either. It sounded more like a hard, controlled attempt to understand what was happening in the space he had always managed at a distance. Lev kept his eyes down. He remained at the window, fussing with the curtains, acting as if his only job was to check the light. But inside, a first spark of recognition stirred. The tone, the intonation, the dry, clipped way of asking questions. It was all weirdly familiar. Like a voice he'd once heard on speaker, back when he still believed he could save his old apartment, the day had started like any other. Morning chaos, breakfast, the struggle to get 4 kids ready for activities without drowning in their "I don't want to" and "let's do it another way." Then, a walk in the garden, a light breeze, the smell of freshly cut grass. Everything ran on the usual track until the house quietly changed its pitch. Lev felt it not so much with his ears as with his skin. The air in the hall thickened. Footsteps became more deliberate. The front door opened on business. Several pairs of expensive shoes, muted voices, quick handshakes. Security moved more actively, but without any show of alarm. That meant the guests were expected. By lunchtime, the house was living in important meeting mode. The maids moved faster than usual. The chef barely left the kitchen, sending out plate after plate of snacks. The housekeeper, always strict, turned a little sharper in her movements. Someone on the staff whispered to Lev on the stairs that people from the real estate side had arrived. That they were discussing renovation of another housing cluster. They said the usual words: project, investment, fund, as if they were talking about anything but real homes and real people. Lev kept to the nursery as much as he could. His job was the children. On days like this, the quadruplets sensed the tension in the adults. Some grew quiet and clung to his legs. Others got noisier, pushing boundaries. He gathered them into games, read short stories, set up a puppet theater. Anything to keep the worry from reaching them through the walls. But the house wasn't soundproof. Sound traveled through air ducts, through the hollow spaces behind drywall, through the floors and the staircase railings. Voices from the upstairs office seeped into the corridors, mingling with the rustle of papers and the faint clink of glasses. Lev didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his hearing, trained by years of survival, pulled out familiar intonations on its own. The owner's voice sounded confident, almost lazy, like a man used to his decisions becoming the default. There was no showy aggression, only cold, honed strength. He drew lines on the mental map of the city without needing a chart in front of him. Talked about districts, buildings, sectors like lines in a spreadsheet. For a second, Lev froze with one of the children in his arms. The conversation upstairs shifted to problem assets. One building on the outskirts came up more than the others, old, unprofitable, full of social cases, families clutching every meter, single omegas with children, elderly people refusing to move. The lawyer's voice was flat as he listed the legal points that could speed up evictions. One of the guests commented on reputation, about possible media backlash. The owner answered without hesitation, calmly, simply. In that same tone Lev had heard once before, coming from a speaker on a cheap desk. He talked again about not dragging the process out, about how it was best to resolve issues with omegas with children at early stages before they found lawyers and public sympathy, about how social noise must not interfere with project implementation. Lev felt everything inside him drop. The sentences he was hearing now almost exactly matched the ones he'd heard that day in the cramped office when he'd sat there asking for an extension on his rent. Back then the voice traveled along wires, detached from any face. Now that same timbre, those same pauses, that barely noticeable smirk on the word problematic, lived inside the walls of the house where he slept, ate, and raised this man's children. He carefully set the child down on the rug and went out into the corridor under the excuse of getting water. The truth was, he just needed to move a couple of steps so air could reach his lungs again. His heart was pounding too fast. His fingers, gripping the glass, had gone white. On the staircase, the sound was even clearer. Lev stopped without going up and, whether he wanted to or not, heard one of the guests ask a question about a specific address. The address was his, that same building on the edge of town with stained stairwells, sagging balconies full of laundry, neighbor fights in a single tiny shop on the ground floor. The building he'd clung to for as long as he could, where he'd hidden his pregnancy under oversized clothes, where he'd rocked his child to sleep to the noise of someone else's TV behind the wall. Now that building existed in the upstairs world as a renovation object, ruining the nice columns in someone's report. He realized they were literally writing his past into a PowerPoint. From that second on, the voice and the last name finally fused into one person, the owner of the house on the hill. Father of the quadruplets. The man whose footsteps he heard at night, whose presence cut the corridors like a blade, was no longer an abstract alpha businessman. He was that same ruthless landlord whose signature on a form could send Lev and his son onto the street. The man who didn't know his name and didn't care, but had already almost broken his life once. His thoughts scattered. One part of his mind clung desperately to the last weeks, the children's laughter, the daytime games, the warm little hands gripping his on the stairs. The other part coldly lined up the facts. This man could do anything. He moved districts, houses, lives around the board. He didn't see people like Lev as people, only as faulty elements in the system. Terror crept up not from the fact that the truth had come out. It came from the sheer scale of it. In that moment, Lev felt sharply just how thin the line was that he'd been walking. On one side, the children he had grown attached to so fast and so deeply it scared him. On the other, a person for whom he himself, his son, his old life, meant nothing if they got in the way of another deal. His throat closed up. For a heartbeat, he wanted to throw everything, the job, the room, the relative safety. Just grab his things, take his son from the neighbor, and disappear somewhere that voice would never reach. But in reality, that kind of place didn't exist. The city belonged to people like him, only sharper, more successful, more cynical. Right here, inside the story, a soft hook is born for those who aren't just listening to this as a fairy tale. A reminder, for many who are now hearing this as a voiceover or reading it in subtitles, Lev's situation isn't fantasy. How many times has a stranger's voice on the phone decided whether you get to stay in your apartment?
How many times has somebody else's last name at the bottom of a document decided if you will have money tomorrow for medicine, for food, for daycare? If you've listened this far and recognize at least a small piece of your own reality in this description, this is a good moment to support the story a little. A short comment about whether you've ever faced these kinds of inhuman decisions. That's not just for the platform's algorithm. It's a way of saying, yes, I also know what it feels like when your life is discussed in someone's office as a line in a report. That is a soft hook that holds attention not with cheap shock, but through recognition, through that same quiet pain that lives under the skin of so many people. Then the narration returns to the house on the hill. Lev stood on the staircase landing, shoulder pressed against the cold wall. From below came the quiet murmur of a cartoon the maid had put on for the kids.
From above, fragments of phrases about square meters, renovation timelines, legal risks. Between these two floors stood Lev, a man who depended on this alpha and at the same time hated that part of his life where he treated people like furniture. He forced himself to go back to the nursery, took a breath, smoothed his face, made sure none of the children saw what state he was in. The beta mask slid back into place, smooth and solid. But now, behind it, something pulsed that he could no longer ignore. He was living in the house of a man who, without a second thought, would have thrown his old life onto the trash heap. He was taking care of the alpha's children, for whom his own child would be nothing more than another inconvenient line in the social cases section. That thought didn't go away, no matter how hard he tried. It settled at the core of a new, deeper conflict. From now on, every step through this house, every glance at the quadruplets, every breath taken in the owner's presence was colored by that knowledge. And somewhere deep down, Lev already understood. A collision between them was inevitable. From that day on, the house really did sound different. Outwardly, nothing changed. The same long hallways, stone polished to a matte shine, the smell of coffee in the morning and expensive cleaning solution in the evening. But every time the office door upstairs opened and the heavy, confident scent of the alpha drifted into the air, something twitched inside Lev, like an exposed nerve. He could no longer hide behind the convenient word, owner. In every step on the stairs, he now heard the man whose signature had once almost thrown him and his child out on the street. In every short instruction from the housekeeper, passed along as his decision, he saw that same cold logic where people were nothing but cells in a table. His first instinct was to leave, to vanish from this house as quietly as he had entered it. In his mind, he tried on that scenario. Pack his few belongings, ride back to the old neighborhood, climb the familiar stairs, unlock the door to his rented apartment. He even tried to imagine the smell: stale damp, cheap detergent, the faded scent of the kid's shampoo he washed his son's hair with. And every time the picture shattered against reality, the apartment was under threat. The building was on the problem list. The management company had already sent several letters with red stamps, and now, after the meeting upstairs, Lev understood clearly. This wasn't just intimidation. It was part of a precise scheme. Going back there wouldn't mean home. It would mean waiting to be evicted. His son was still living with the neighbor. She stayed calm and practical, without drama, but every short message from her cut him to the bone. He misses you. Tonight he didn't want to fall asleep without your story. He asked when you're coming. Lev read those lines at night, when the alpha's children were asleep, and felt that familiar heaviness rising in his chest like slow suffocation. On the other hand, every day in the house on the hill tied him more tightly to the quadruplets. They accepted him without questions, knowing nothing about his status, his past, or who their father was to other people in the city. For them, he was the one who brought water when their throats hurt, who sat beside them while fever burned, who could tell by their scent when a cold was coming and when it was just tiredness. One day, one of the boys fell ill. The fever came up suddenly, toward evening. The doctor left with the standard set of recommendations in medicine, but the real hours started after that. The night stretched into an endless cycle of cooling, wet towels and quiet, half-conscious sighs from a small body on the pillow. Lev sat next to him, counted his breaths, laid his hand on his forehead, listened to each change in his breathing. At some point, the boy, not really waking up, whispered through his sleep, in that simple way that makes everything inside you clench. "Don't go." Lev answered just as quietly, automatically, knowing the child probably wouldn't hear. "I'm here." That scene burned itself into his memory. He had held his own son like that once, with a fever, in a cramped room with peeling walls, cheap medicine from the night pharmacy bought with his last cash. He had whispered the same words to his own child. The only difference was that back then there was no safety net at all. If he had collapsed, there was no one to catch either of them. Here, at least on paper, there was a system. A doctor on call, staff, money for medicine. The more attached he became to the children, the more complicated the calculation grew. Leaving now meant abandoning them in the middle of the constant nanny turnover. Staying meant waking up and going to bed every day in the presence of a man he now feared and almost physically despised. At night, lying in his small staff room, Lev spun through the options like heavy, sharp stones in his hands. Each one could cut him. The first, leave now, while there was still only an agreement with the agency and no final contract with the owner. Take his son from the neighbor, try to find another job, even if it paid less and was further away. Live on the edge again, but at least without that constant feeling that every breath he took belonged to one particular alpha. The second, stay, keep playing the beta, and hold on until the old building really went under renovation. By then, maybe he could save some money, create a small cushion, find a way to move to another district, another city, any point on the map where the owner's last name wasn't mentioned in every news broadcast. The third, the scariest, tell the truth. Admit his status, his child, the fact that he had once been precisely that social case from the report. Lev dropped this option almost instantly. Honesty in a world where alphas decided the fate of whole blocks was rarely safe, especially from an omega who had spent his whole life learning to freeze in the shadows. Every time he ran these scenarios, he came back to the same point: his son. If he walked out now, the income vanished. If he stayed, the money continued, but the price for it rose every day: fear, tension, risk of exposure. Whatever he chose, the child remained the center everything revolved around. Not career plans, not pride, not the need to prove something to anyone, but a basic animal instinct. Give this small person a chance not to end up on the street. At the same time, his attachment to the quadruplets only deepened. He found himself comparing things: their room and his son's old room, their pile of toys and his boy's single worn plush lion, their full plates, and those days when he split one piece of bread between two of them. There was no jealousy toward the alpha's children in that comparison, only a strange, quiet relief that at least some of them would never know hunger. Sometimes he caught himself thinking of these 4 kids as part of his own responsibility, not just as a job or a line in his contract, but as living beings he was responsible for, just like his own child. And that made the idea of leaving even heavier. A quiet, nagging guilt rose inside him. If he disappeared, they would once again be left without a stable figure. Once again, they would look at the next nanny with guarded suspicion. The more he tried to rationalize the situation, the more he understood that any logic smashed against feelings. Reason whispered that you can't live in the house of a man who despises you on a social level. His heart answered that he was already too needed by those who had done nothing wrong. On top of everything, the outside world kept reminding him that soon he might not have a choice at all. The neighbors sent brief voice messages. A commission had come to the yard, measuring things, taking photos, questioning residents. A notice about an upcoming meeting was pinned in the entrance. People on the stairwell talked in half whispers. Some claimed the building would be sold for offices, others that they'd be moved to soulless boxes on the edge of town. Lev listened to these messages through his headphones while putting the alpha's children to bed. Quiet voices from his old life overlapped with the rustle of sheets in the nursery, the soft breathing of the quadruplets, the murmur of the night corridor. In his head, the same simple phrase surfaced again and again: "He's got us from both sides." The same man was both a potential savior and the source of threat. One decision could secure Lev work, a room, some stability. Another could take his apartment, cut the last ties between me and my son. That realization froze him. On especially hard nights, he drove himself to the limit, sat on the bed, hands pressed against his eyes, and whispered into the darkness, "What am I supposed to do?" There was, of course, no answer. In the morning, everything started again. The quadruplets demanded porridge, attention, new stories. The house woke up, security changed shifts. Somewhere upstairs, the computer in the office turned on, and Lev got up, walked his usual route, pulled the beta mask over himself once more. Smooth, safe, convenient for the system, he went on living in that suspended state. Every new day didn't bring him closer to a decision, but grew his roots deeper into the house and the children. The trap tightened not with brute force, but through attachment and necessity. The longer he stayed, the clearer it became that any choice would cost him something. The only question was what price he was willing to pay: his freedom, his principles, or a piece of his own heart left behind in someone else's nursery. For now, he didn't know the answer. He just kept walking down the corridor, holding 2 of the 4 children by the hand, as if that alone could somehow keep the whole crooked world from falling apart. The crisis came the way big turning points usually come to people who can't afford mistakes, deep in the night when the house was pretending to sleep. Lev didn't wake up from his alarm or from the usual noise in the hallway. Something else dragged him out of sleep, a specific, jagged sound he'd learned to recognize back when his own child was a baby. Quick 2 rapid breaths, broken breathing, a short, dry moan. Not a scream, not crying. The sound a body makes when it admits it can't cope on its own anymore. He was on his feet almost instantly. His legs found his slippers by themselves. His hand grabbed the thermometer and the box of fever medicine on autopilot. Even before he opened his door, Lev already knew. This wasn't a nightmare, not a simple fear of the dark. The air in the hallway was thicker, warmer, and carried that sharp, familiar smell, a child's fever. The oldest boy was first. His cheeks burned, hair stuck to his forehead, eyes shone with a dull, glassy light. He tossed around the bed, sheet twisted into a knot, a toy car lying on the floor like a thrown anchor. When Lev placed the thermometer under his arm, his own fingers trembled slightly. The skin was too hot, as if someone had turned a heater up to maximum in the room. The numbers flashed red, but he didn't need to see them to know. High flashed in his mind. Not yet critical, but far past the level where a damp cloth and soothing words are enough. He woke the housekeeper, gave her a quick, clear explanation. She answered in a sleepy but already focused voice, calling the family doctor. While she talked on the phone, Lev moved on, checking the others. Like a chain reaction, their temperatures began rising too. One complained of chills, another's lips were trembling. A third clutched his pillow more tightly, trying to push away the heat like a blanket he didn't want. Within minutes, the nursery turned into an improvised ward. Windows open for fresh air, damp cloths that Lev changed almost constantly, glasses of water on every nightstand. A house used to precise routines suddenly jumped off its rails. Night staff ran through the corridors. Someone brought extra blankets, someone clean sheets. The air was thick with smells, medicine, sweat, kids' shampoo, and a faint trace of panic. Lev moved between beds along a route his body already knew. His muscles remembered these motions, twisting a towel, laying it on a forehead, checking if it had warmed up, lifting a child when shivers hit, steadying a glass while shaking fingers tried to grasp it. Once he'd done all this in a tiny room with peeling paint, lit by a cheap nightlight, with his own son in his arms. Now the furniture was expensive and the curtains were heavy, but the fear was the same, the fear of not being fast enough. The doctor was still on his way, and time stretched into something sticky and endless. Lev listened to each child's breathing. The world shrank to those breaths, the thermometer readings, the feel of every hot forehead under his palm. He didn't think about himself at all, only about holding the line until help arrived. And that was the moment the owner walked in. No rustle of a suit, no clack of business shoes. The alpha stepped into the nursery almost silently, barefoot in a plain dark t-shirt and loose house pants. No professional armor, yet somehow even more solid. His presence changed the air, as if pressure from the outside entered the room with him. He stopped on the threshold for a heartbeat, taking in the scene. 4 small bodies in different stages of feverish half-dream. Lev with a wet cloth in his hands, the housekeeper on the phone, the laundry girl carefully gathering dirty linens into a basket. Something like horror flashed in the Alpha's eyes, quick, almost childlike, his children all at once sick and helpless. He crossed the room in a few long strides. Those heavy steps, so familiar to Lev, usually full of control and authority, sounded different now, charged with tension, the clash between the urge to act and not knowing how. Who's worst? The question came out short and flat, without extra words, without panic, but with a metal edge underneath. Lev answered automatically, pointing to the bed where the hottest boy lay. His hand shook just slightly as he adjusted the compress, and in that moment he made a simple human mistake. For a second, he forgot about himself. Adrenaline was doing its job. His heart beat faster, his breathing grew deeper. His body reacted to stress, to focus, to the need to keep control. Where the blockers usually smoothed everything into an even, safe background, a fine crack appeared. His scent, which he had been suppressing so carefully, shifted just a little. Not a wave, not a sharp burst, more like a faint extra note in the night air. Not everyone would catch it. Not among the smells of sweat, medicine, and melting ice from the compresses. But the Alpha was standing close enough. His nostrils twitched, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a deliberate movement, more an instinct, the body reacting before the brain. His gaze slid over Lev and, for a split second, narrowed, focused. There was no accusation yet, no conclusion. Just the silent mark. Something doesn't add up. Lev felt that moment too. It was as if he physically heard his usual mask crack. Everything in him tightened. It felt like someone had suddenly switched off the light in the house and turned on a spotlight aimed right at him. For half a second, he wanted to retreat, run back to his room, lock the door, and breathe in more blockers. But behind him, a child moaned, and he simply couldn't allow himself the luxury of running. The night went on. The doctor arrived deep into the dark when the kitchen clock had already passed another hour and no one was counting anymore. Tired but focused, he examined all 4 children, measured oxygen levels, listened to lungs. Some of the invisible weight lifted from the Alpha's shoulders when the doctor named it clearly. A viral infection, strong but not deadly. Standard treatment, plenty of fluids, monitoring. For Lev, those were familiar words, but now they worked almost like anesthetic. The raw fear of "they're dying" shifted into the more manageable "we have to do this and this and this." The doctor left detailed instructions in boxes of medicine. The house rearranged itself into a night watch. Lev stayed. He didn't sleep at all. Swapped towels, checked temperatures, held cups, shifted light blankets from one child to another, depending on whether they shook with chills or burned with heat. Sometimes the housekeeper took over for a few minutes so he could at least wash his face and change his t-shirt soaked with sweat and medicine. Even then, he never dropped his readiness. The Alpha didn't leave either. At first, he stood aside, as if afraid of getting in the way. Then he sat in a chair at the foot of the bed where the fever ran highest. He didn't interfere, didn't question Lev's actions, only occasionally flicked his eyes from the boy's face to the thermometer screen. There was still helpless terror in his eyes, but now another note appeared over it. Cold, fixed determination to watch it through to the end. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th hour of the night, the fevers began to break. Not suddenly, but in tiny steps, half a degree at a time, as if the house itself was finally exhaling. One child stopped thrashing and dropped into heavy but steady sleep. Another stopped moaning, his mouth relaxed. Wet patches from tears and sweat stayed on the pillows, but their breathing settled. By morning, a strange, sticky quiet hung in the room. Not complete. There were still the faint noises of sheets, an occasional whimper in a dream, a footstep in the hall. But compared to the feverish chaos of the night, it felt almost like peace. And in that quiet, Lev felt a different wave rise over the exhaustion, anxiety. When the last numbers on the thermometers slid down into safer territory, and the doctor on the phone confirmed there was no immediate danger, the owner finally allowed himself to look not just at the children, but at the man who had sat by them all night. That look weighed more than any sentence. There was no "thank you," no "you did well." Only a long, measuring study, as if the Alpha were trying to put together everything he already knew with what he had just felt. Lev stood there with an empty bowl in his hands, feeling his body turn to stone with fatigue. His knees shook, his back ached, his eyes burned from lack of sleep and dry air. But what hurt most was that place inside where fear and conscience lived. He felt exposed, even though no one had said anything out loud yet. He remembered the alpha's nostrils twitching in that second when Lev's scent had slipped under the pressure of adrenaline. The narrowed gaze that had paused on him, not the child. How now, in this strange pre-dawn half-light, the owner was looking at him not as just another nanny, but as a variable where something didn't match. Instinct told him, explain, talk, invent a cover story. His rational mind whispered, any extra word right now will sound like a confession. He chose the third option, silence. The alpha stayed silent too. He only gave a short nod, as if acknowledging Lev's work, his own suspicions, and the fact that a serious conversation between them was inevitable. Not here, not now, with sleeping children around them. Later, when the house was back under daylight and the night no longer hid things. When Lev finally stepped out into the hallway, it felt endless. The walls swayed a little, every part of him begged for at least an hour of sleep. But over the physical pain, there was one thought hammering at his temples. The mask had cracked. The house that, only a short time ago, seemed like shelter from poverty and street threats, had once again turned into a potential stage for exposure. Only now, the stakes weren't just his job or even his roof. They were his child, hidden in that old neighborhood. His ability to keep helping the quadruplets. His one fragile right to be somewhere in this world, not just an item in someone else's report. He went back to his small room, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time that night allowed himself to close his eyes. Even in that short, broken sleep, he dreamed the same thing over and over. The nursery door flung open, children burning with fever, a heavy male gaze, and a barely spoken but very real question that still hadn't been said out loud. Who are you really? The conversation didn't hit Lev right after that night. For a few days, the house lived in a strange waiting mode. The quadruplets got better, fevers dropped, their usual rituals slid back into place. Medicine gave way to vitamins, wet towels to fresh duvet covers. Night watches to daytime walks in the garden. Only the air didn't go back to normal. Lev felt it with his skin. The staff's glances grew more careful, even though no one but him, the owner, and the housekeeper knew what had happened in the nursery. The alpha's footsteps in the corridor were still rare, but every time he passed by, Lev felt that brief, attentive swipe of his gaze. Not hostile, not angry, more like a study. He waited to be called in for the agency to ring for a formal notice of termination. Any little thing felt like a sign. A call from reception, a passing mention of a lawyer visiting, even the rustle of documents in the housekeeper's hands. Everything sounded like it might be the beginning of the end. When the invitation finally came, it was completely ordinary. The housekeeper simply said the owner wanted to see him in the office, as if it were about some routine matter. No, we need to talk. No heavy hints. Lev went upstairs, counting the steps to keep from thinking. 1, 2, 3. On each one, he repeated to himself, breathe, don't lie. Don't start defending yourself too early. His heart pounded anyway. The office met him with thick silence. It still smelled of paper, coffee, and that expensive cologne Lev now associated with iron decisions. Drawings and plans hung on the wall. One monitor was off, the other glowed with spreadsheets. The window looked out onto the garden, but the curtains were partly drawn, so daylight entered in stripes, making the room feel like a cage with carefully measured bars. The alpha sat behind the desk, but not hiding behind it like a shield. His elbows rested on the chair's arms, fingers interlaced, chin slightly tilted forward. He didn't look furious. He looked focused. And that, somehow, was worse. Lev stopped at the desk, keeping the distance he allowed himself as staff. His back straightened on its own, shoulders tensed. He had taken his blockers on time. His body was under control, but being in that room felt like standing there without skin. The question came at once, without any warm-up. The alpha didn't raise his voice or play good cop, bad cop. He simply stated the fact. That night, the beta scent had slipped. And the mismatch was too clear to blame it on stress or fatigue. His words were precise, like shots at a target. No accusations, no threats. Just a statement. What was written in the documents and what he had smelled did not match. Lev's throat went dry. For a moment, he really did think about trying yet another lie. Something about special medication, hormonal issues, anything. But then he remembered that night's look in the Alpha's eyes over the child's bed. Exhausted, but absolutely clear. There was no point lying to someone like that to his face. "I'm an Omega." The phrase had been echoing in his head long before he said it out loud. When it finally left his mouth, the room seemed to turn a little colder. He didn't dress it up. He talked about the blockers he started taking when he realized that, with his status open, every job offer came with the risk of becoming someone's convenient target. About agencies that turned him away the moment they saw the word Omega on a form. About the one time he trusted too much and was offered terms that made him sick to his stomach. He didn't paint himself as a victim or a hero. He just lined up the chain: fear, pills, a false line on a resume, a chance to get into this house, knowing full well every sentence might be used against him. But silence would definitely be a sentence. He said nothing about his child, not because he didn't trust at all, but because that fact was too fragile for this first exchange. His son was the softest, most vulnerable point. If things went bad, if they decided to throw him out, knowing about the boy would give them another lever. For now, that stayed in his own hidden pocket. The Alpha listened without interrupting. His fingers occasionally tightened on the armrests, but his face didn't change. At one point, he picked up a folder from the desk, a copy of the same documents Lev had signed when he started. His eyes lingered on the status line, where Beta was written neatly. When he spoke again, there was a new layer to his voice: cold, controlled anger. Not the kind that explodes into shouting, but the kind people use when they act through lawyers and contracts. He talked about trust, about the fact that this house did not admit people without checks, that having an Omega on staff, in direct contact with children, was a different level of risk, not just personal, but legal. Insurance, reputation, foundations, child welfare, a whole layer of obligations Lev might not even know existed. But that was still there. Each phrase sounded like a verdict. Lev stood there, listening, and braced himself internally for the final step, the dry "you're fired" and a quick call to the agency, after which he'd be back at a door with his suitcase in his hand. But then the conversation turned unexpectedly. The Alpha suddenly asked not about documents, but about another building. The one on the outskirts where, according to rumors, residents were being prepared for eviction under the label of renovation. He named the district, the street, the exact block. Too precise to be a coincidence. Lev didn't have time to invent a vague answer. He lifted his eyes and simply nodded. "Yes," sounded in his head, and that quiet "yes" hurt more than everything that had come before. He started talking, at first carefully, in that dry tone he used when describing something distant, about the building management, the letter with the red stamp, how they were told plainly that the place was going for repairs and the residents would be moved somewhere later. About the office, where a voice-over speakerphone called people like him problem tenants, ballast that had to be cleared out. Then the words got heavier on their own. He talked about nights spent in the kitchen, staring at his sleeping child and imagining them both in a temporary shelter in a large room full of other relocated families. About counting every coin to pay one more month's rent and push off the inevitable. About how, long ago, he had naively believed that building owners could picture the people behind arrears lines. He didn't throw direct accusations or names, but eventually he still said it. "It was your building." The silence that followed turned thick. Only the faint hum of the AC and the ticking of the clock on the wall broke it. Lev felt his own heartbeat beating too loudly. For the Alpha, it was like being shoved in front of a mirror he'd never wanted. He was used to seeing numbers, occupancy percentages, return on investment graphs. Even social cases were at best rows in a report, cost of settlement, legal deadlines, risk of scandal. The people behind those rows stayed abstract. And now one of those cases stood in front of him, alive, dark-eyed, exhausted from several sleepless nights beside his children. The very same man whose address had once been part of a package of signatures. Not accusing, but showing the human cost of those decisions. His reaction was not pretty. Different impulses collided inside him. One, the old one, demanded defense. This man had lied in his application, faked his status, forged documents, broken safety rules. Fire him, tear up the contract, let the lawyers close the gaps. It was the simple, logical path, another, newer one, stubbornly brought back that night in the nursery. Feverish faces of his children. Lev, who, without sleep or rest, held the whole house together while the alpha himself stood off to the side, not knowing where to put his strength. It reminded him that this man had become a pillar where many others would already have walked away. And there was a third layer, the unpleasant realization that his own real estate decisions had driven people like Lev into corners where the only way out they saw was lying on application forms. Lev stood silent. He knew that any word now could become the last straw. A justification would sound weak, anger, ungrateful. Begging would strip him of the last bit of self-respect. The decision didn't appear at once. It showed in the alpha's face, in how slowly his fingers unclasped and squeezed again, how he turned his gaze toward the window as if the trees outside might offer a ready answer. When he spoke again, his voice didn't soften, but it did deepen. He didn't pretend this could all be written off as a misunderstanding. He stated clearly that Lev had lied when he took the job, a fact that couldn't be ignored, that the contract would have to be rewritten, that the agency would have to be informed, that they would have to sort out his legal status in the house, properly this time. The risks that came with having an Omega in the house had not gone anywhere, but even then, he did not say the expected words about firing him. Instead, a new note slipped into his voice, a kind of probation. Not formal yet, not written into any contract, as if he had pushed the final decision into the future. Not out of pity, but because for the first time in his life, pure math had collided with something else. For Lev, it was a strange, heavy relief. He had not won, but he had not completely lost either. He wasn't thrown out of the house, he wasn't stripped of his right to be near the children. Instead of a sentence, he got a reprieve. Temporary, fragile, but still a chance. One thing was obvious. After this conversation, neither he nor the alpha could look at each other as abstract pieces on a board. Each had seen his own shadow in the other, and the house on the hill, for the first time, became not just a workplace and not just a fortress from the outside, but a stage where two pasts collided, the wealthy alpha used to counting by districts, and the Omega who had been one of those pushed out of those same districts. The storm did not come from the sky. No thunder, no black clouds over the hill. At first, it was short messages on his phone, flashing words like notice, inspection, urgent. Then, photos of the entrance hall, where a new sheet of paper with the city seal hung on the board next to faded ads. The paper shone with fresh ink, like a joke at their expense. The neighbor wrote more and more often and more nervously. In the evening, a photo of an envelope with the official emblem. In the morning, a shot of the line of tenants waiting to get into the tiny office of the building manager. By day, screenshots from the building group chat where the old jokes had been buried under non-stop threads. What do we do? Who do we call? Is there any point in petitions? Voices mixed there. Old people saying, they won't take this while I'm alive. Tired parents clinging to their kindergarten and clinic. Young ones ready to shrug and accept whatever compensation they were offered, just to avoid lawyers and courts. In every message, Lev heard a familiar taste. That mix of fear and stubborn, desperate hope. He rarely replied. Mostly he just read and gripped his phone until his knuckles went white. From the outside, it looked like his life had split into two parallel lines. In the morning, the house on the hill, neat paths, a manicured garden, the housekeeper's voice listing tasks. By day, children's voices, porridge on the table, the systematic chaos of quadruplets. In the evening, short, dry messages from the outskirts. The commission came. They say we'll get fewer square meters. The woman from the third floor is crying. There's nowhere to take her old father. Inside, those lines had already twisted together. He now knew who stood behind the signatures on the renovation plan. The last name he'd feared on official letters belonged to the same man whose footsteps he heard at night on the second floor, to the man who paid his salary, to the man he trusted with his employer's children and could not trust with his own apartment. Every time the owner picked up the phone and talked about project partners or launch dates, something inside Lev tightened. He saw not an abstract housing stock, but a specific building entrance, shabby but his. A specific kitchen where his son once drew shapes with crumbs on the table. A specific neighbor holding someone else's child and trying not to show that she was scared. At some point, the tension became almost physical, as if someone had stretched an invisible wire between his chest and the office walls. The breaking point came in the evening, when the children finally slept without fever and the house exhaled for a second. Lev sat on the carpet in the nursery, listening to the steady breathing of the quadruplets and reading another message. The neighbor wrote that they'd formed an initiative group, that on the weekend they planned to stand outside the building with signs. That someone had suggested writing to the media, so at least someone sees how they're throwing us out. The neighbor added carefully, "If you can, tell someone up there. Maybe they still have a heart." Lev stared at that last sentence for a long time. Then he switched off the screen, slowly stood up, adjusted the kids' blankets, and walked out of the room. He didn't go straight to the office. First, the kitchen. To pour water, feel the cold glass under his fingers, force himself to take a few sips. His eyes snatched onto every everyday detail. Plates in the drying rack, a mug someone had left on the counter, a child's sweater thrown over the back of a chair. All of it was part of a life he had entered by pretending to be someone else. But he could no longer pace the house, pretending nothing was happening. The noise from outside was pushing against the walls and echoing back at him. He went upstairs the way you climb a hill before a storm. Steadily, but with that sense of growing weight in the air. The office door was slightly ajar. The alpha sat at the desk, lit by a single lamp that threw hard shadows over the papers. Columns of numbers burned on the laptop screen. He lifted his eyes when Lev knocked and gave a short nod for him to come in. Lev didn't look for a roundabout way in. He knew that if he started with the children or small household details, he'd run out of strength before he reached what mattered. So he went straight to the building on the outskirts, to the renovation, to the letters the tenants had received, to what those square meters meant for people, not as property, but as their last foothold, to the fact that among them was him, and for the first time, to his son. "My child," echoed in the office louder than any shout. Until that moment, his son had been kept outside the brackets, as if you could be a father only halfway, only in that old district, but not on the hill. He didn't talk about a generic kid. He talked about a particular boy, small hands, the habit of falling asleep with a ragged toy pressed against his cheek, the frightened questions about when is dad coming home, about the neighbor, an older single beta who now carried her own loneliness, someone else's child, and the threat of eviction all at once. The alpha listened in silence. His face was a little harder than usual, his gaze heavier. In Lev's words, the renovation project suddenly stopped being a slick presentation for investors. Behind the facade of the building, real people pushed through. Real rooms, the smell of thin soup, old wallpaper, children's cream. At the same time, outside, pressure only grew. His phones, most likely, did not stop ringing the whole day. Partners pushing for deadlines, officials for signatures, financiers for cost confirmations. For them it was simple. Build new, good, any delay, expensive. The tenant's emotions were not in any column. The alpha's internal conflict became almost tangible. Lev saw him shut his eyes briefly, as if trying to push out what he had just heard. This was a man used to justifying every move with a calculation. And right now, the math said only one thing: stay the course. To stop meant to admit a mistake, to lose money and face. But somewhere underneath another line played on, what price he was used to paying to protect that face, and what exactly he would see next time he walked into the nursery. An Omega who had been one of those problem tenants, or a father who now held two addresses in his head, both depending on one signature. Lev didn't ask for miracles. He didn't say, cancel everything. He knew the world didn't change with one conversation. All he did was outline the choice that had already formed between them. Even if the alpha tried not to look at it, he could close his eyes, sign every document, finish the renovation, get his profit, and leave partners satisfied. He could fire the nanny who turned out to be too complicated and hire another one with clean papers and no uncomfortable questions. Or he could try, at least try, to use the same power that had crushed people to soften the hit even a little. Rework the terms, pick a different block for demolition, give people more time, more guarantees. Lose money, but gain something else, something that didn't yet fit into his usual formulas. In those days, the house on the hill lived on the edge of two storms. In one, children's laughter, recovering voices, schedules drifting back to normal. In the other, chat scandals, protest prep, paid legal consultations that tenants scraped together for with 100 here, 200 there, whatever they could afford. Lev stood between them like a man being pulled in both directions. Part of him wanted to go back to the old district for the weekend, to stand in the rain with the neighbors outside that peeling entrance, holding a cardboard sign and shouting until someone at City Hall heard. Another part knew he was needed here now by the children he had promised not to disappear on, and by the man whose decision would decide those protests. Choosing a side didn't really begin at the protest or in the municipal offices. It started in that dark room upstairs, where an alpha used to treating people as numbers was forced for the first time to see Lev and his son inside those numbers. At this point, the story doesn't hand out a final answer yet. It simply sharpens the question. What would he do next? Stand shoulder to shoulder with his partners, or go against the current, even if only for the sake of one old building on the outskirts and one boy waiting for his father not on the hill but under a leaking roof? The decision didn't fall from the sky in a single day. It grew like the slow turn of a heavy ship, first an almost invisible shift, then a gradual but unstoppable change of course. At first, the alpha simply delayed his signatures. Renovation papers that used to be sent to the city administration the same day now lay on his desk for a day, two, then a week. The lawyers grew anxious. The partners reminded him of deadlines, but he stubbornly put off the final yes. It looked like a whim until he asked for different reports. Other files started coming into his office. Not consolidated tables of square meters and cost, but lists of tenants, age, family composition, health, ties to local schools and clinics. Notes appeared next to the dry names. Retired woman, lives alone, family with 3 children, single mother, child Omega. And in those lines, Lev recognized himself, even if his name was hidden behind initials. The building on the outskirts stopped being just an object on the map. In the alpha's mind, it started to sound different, a rough, uneven chorus of actual lives. Mixed into that noise was Lev's quiet, stubborn voice, still coming to the office after putting the kids to bed and calmly reminding him that every line in those tables meant not a meeting, but a sleepless night for someone. The partners did not like it. In their heads, he had always been the one who cut without a shaky hand. Now he was asking uncomfortable questions. Can we soften the conditions? Is phased repair an option? What happens to those who truly have nowhere else to go? To do that, he was ready to lose part of the profit, redo financing, take on risks he had always avoided. The negotiations took place behind closed doors. On the surface, everything looked almost calm. Business dinners, dry handshakes, neutral headlines in the finance press. But Lev felt the internal storm in the alpha's voice when he returned to the house. There was a roughness there now, the kind that gives away someone who spent the day not multiplying, but resisting. In the end, one of the lines snapped. One partner pulled out of the project. Another started making demands that were incompatible with the new logic. The alpha chose to lose a contract rather than go back to the original plan, with Lev's building marked for demolition. To the outside world, it looked strange and risky. To Lev, like a quiet, very specific miracle. The redevelopment plan didn't disappear, but it changed shape. Instead of total eviction for a few years and promises on paper to return to new apartments later, there were options for unit-by-unit repairs, structural reinforcement without moving everyone out, compensation for those who chose to leave voluntarily. Most importantly, Lev's building stopped being problematic in the old sense. It became a long-term renovation project, not a sacrifice to fast money. The neighbor texted him a single short line. Looks like they're letting us stay. For now. That, for now, carried everything. Distrust, cautious joy. Later, she sent a photo from a tenant meeting where a company rep presented the new plan. People stood there holding coats and document folders against their chests, still unsure whether to believe. But in the air, instead of doomed resignation, there was a thin, fragile note of relief. For Lev, it wasn't an ending. It was the point where he could finally stop picturing himself and his child out on the street every night. Out there, on the outskirts, his old life had a future again. Here on the hill, he now had to decide what that future would look like. Inside the house, change started quietly. First, with a conversation the alpha began not in the office but in the kitchen, late at night, when the whole place was wrapped in soft silence. He didn't speak the way he did to subordinates. His voice held less steel and more tired but honest admission. He really had reworked the project. Yes, it cost money. Yes, a few people thought him weak for it. But it made sleep easier. Then, with an offer, this time on paper. The new contract lay on the library table when Lev came down one night, unable to sleep. No red stamps, no final warnings. Just a neat, thick document where his name appeared not only in the employee section, but in several others. The employment contract stayed, but its edges shifted. New clauses appeared, broader responsibility, the right to make day-to-day decisions in the kids' care and education, access to certain information about the house. Added to that was a residency agreement, assigning a separate wing of the house to Lev and his son. Not staff quarters, but a small block that could honestly be called their own space. The strangest part for him was a short line about personal circumstances. He read it twice, waiting for the trap. It stated that his employer was aware of Lev's status as an omega and as a father, and committed to taking that into account when planning his schedule and workload. It was almost absurd. A world where being an omega and a parent wasn't a reason to shut doors, but something that required protection. He sat over the papers for a long time, feeling as if he held an alternate version of his life in his hands, one where he didn't have to hide behind blockers and doctored medical records, where he didn't have to choose between his child's safety and the truth about himself. His son became a separate topic. This time, the initiative came not only from Lev. The alpha, who had so far known about the boy only as a fact mentioned in a couple of sentences, raised it himself. How old was he? Where did he live? How long had Lev not really lived at home, but only dropped by between shifts, saying out loud that his son was living with the neighbor hurt. But the moment he did, something in the air shifted. The shadow of secrecy that had made his position so shaky dissolved. In its place came a simpler, heavier fact. This house now had a chance to become a home for one more child. Bringing the boy in wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a logistical operation, full of small and not-so-small tasks. They had to sort out school, medical records, the official address, 1,000 bureaucratic knots tying him to the old life. The alpha gave instructions to his staff, the lawyers made calls, a security car drove out to the old district. On the day his son crossed the threshold of the house on the hill, the space itself seemed to change key. His footsteps sounded different from those of the quadruplets, cautious, careful, used to checking where the carpet edge was, how the floor creaked. Lev saw the familiar fear in those movements, not letting yourself believe in a new place fully, so it hurts less if you lose it. The quadruplets took in the new kid loudly and almost instantly. For them, another child was an extension of their game, not a drama. They shared toys, argued about whose bed was cooler, started spontaneous races down the corridor. The house filled with another dense layer of children's noise. And if before, Lev sometimes caught himself thinking that the silence in his staff room felt too thick, now, even at night, there was a trace of someone else's presence there, not just his own. The new agreement between him and the alpha existed in 2 dimensions at once. On paper it was clear: job description, hours, limits, liability. Inside, it was messier. An unspoken understanding that neither of them would pretend their paths had just randomly crossed anymore. The alpha stopped seeing him only through the lens of that original lie. Yes, falsifying his status hadn't vanished. Yes, allowing an omega into a house with children still carried real risk. But layered over that now was something else. The feverish night when Lev held his child's hand, the talks that pulled the old building out from under the wrecking ball, the quadruplets' trust, not because they had to, but because he was their adult. Lev stopped seeing him only as the ruthless landlord with the voice on the speakerphone. The sharp edges remained: power, money, the habit of counting. But there was another side now, too. The man who, even reluctantly, had hit the brakes on his own machine for the sake of someone else's entrance hall and someone else's boy. Under those new conditions, the house on the hill stopped being just a workplace. It was still a place of power, control, and hard choices. Lawyers still came and went, partners still called, schedules still mattered. But woven into that rigid frame was a softer, steadier line. A house that didn't level other people's walls just because it was easier. For Lev, it meant that for the first time in a long while, he had 2 homes that were not at war with each other. The old building on the outskirts, with its flaking walls, now promised repair without eviction. And the new one, on the hill, where where his son now slept in a room without the fear of a knock at the door or a letter with a red stamp. In the evenings, when all 5 kids fell asleep almost at the same time, 4 in one part of the house and 1 in another, he walked the halls listening to their breathing. The house sounded different now than on the day he first crossed its threshold with a beta mask and a suitcase. Back then, the walls felt smooth and foreign, like a shop window. Now, they held the memory of a choice both men had made. The new agreement didn't make them equals. The world was still uneven. But within that unevenness, there was now room for Lev's voice, for his child, for a house that stayed standing. Time passed, not just a few weeks, but season after season. The house on the hill lived through its own small life, its first storms, its first childhood illnesses, its first big decisions made not only for profit, but also for people. Its sound changed. Mornings here no longer began with a dull thud of boots on marble or the frantic snap of elevator doors like in Lev's old world. They began with mismatched footsteps on wooden floors with whispering and giggles. The quadruplets were no longer the wild tornado that had charged him in his first days. They'd stretched, grown stronger, sketched out their own edges. One had become thoughtful, sorting toys by color. Another, a loud ringleader. The third, a quiet observer. The fourth, the born negotiator, able to talk anyone into anything. Lev's younger son fit into that ensemble surprisingly naturally. At first, he stayed on the sidelines, clinging to his father's sleeve, watching every move the adults made as if waiting for the place to vanish. Slowly, his step grew surer, his voice clearer. He learned to argue over toys, to lose without tears, to win without gloating. His bed no longer looked temporary. Drawings appeared on the wall next to it, little treasures on his nightstand. The daily schedule was still dense. Mornings, the house looked like a train station. Backpacks, indoor shoes, checking club schedules, reminders about music lessons and sports. Lev moved through the chaos along scars he'd worn into the floorboards. He tied laces, found missing notebooks, smoothed out little conflicts. In his hands, the lives of 5 children merged into a single, manageable flow. The main difference between these mornings and the ones he'd had on the outskirts was simple. There was no constant fear. The kids could worry about tests or fights with friends, but none of them woke in the night at the sound of a knock paired with a red-stamped envelope. The house was solid. Lev felt it almost physically, in how calmly the walls breathed, in how confidently the doors locked at night, in how the security staff watched both outside and in, keeping a respectful distance from family life. The alpha had changed too. He hadn't turned into a soft toy or a flawless father from an ad. His sharpness remained, as did his habit of demanding a lot, mostly from himself. But he came into the kids' rooms more often now. He had learned to be there not only when something was on fire, a fever, a problem, a call from school. There were evenings when he simply sat on the floor, back against the wall, while the children built a pillow fort around him. Nights when he was the one to walk the hallway, checking that everyone slept, even though Lev already had. Sometimes he stopped outside the door to listen as Lev told the children stories. Not the ones where Omegas were doomed to be victims, but others. About tiny kitchens in old buildings, neighbors who shared their last food, about how you can still laugh even in the tightest of rooms. For the kids, these were just stories. For Lev, they were his own life rewritten, carefully translated into a softer language. The renovation project that had once been a threat to Lev now lived its own separate life. The old building was changing slowly. Reinforcement here, new wiring there, insulated walls. The residents stayed. Some moved temporarily to a neighbor's flat upstairs, some to the building next door, but always within the same neighborhood. The smell there was no longer one of looming disaster, only dust from construction and that strange mix of old and new. Sometimes Lev went there with the kids. They'd step out into the courtyard where the asphalt was still uneven, but no longer a minefield of potholes. The quadruplets turned their heads, taking in entrance halls with no concierges and swings without security cameras. Lev's younger son knew every crack in the plaster, but looked at them differently now, not as a threat, but as part of a story whose worst moment had already passed. Lev showed them the spot where he'd once hung their washing, told them how they used to stuff rolled towels under doors in winter to keep out the draft. He'd say, "Listen, this building breathes another way now. It used to groan. Now it just lives." The kids listened solemnly, even if all they really heard was cars and neighbors' voices. The alpha, when he came along, stood a little aside and watched. There was something on his face like an acknowledgement of his own guilt and of his own choice not to hide from it. The house on the hill, in turn, changed from a carefully curated object into a living place, imperfect in spots, but more real for it. The expensive wallpaper in the hallway now carried children's drawings. The first was an accident. Someone hadn't made it to the paper with a marker. Lev reached for a wet wipe on reflex, but the alpha stopped him with a short, slightly hoarse, "Leave it. That's how sons with crooked rays, houses with square windows, and stick figures with arms coming out of their heads took up permanent residence on the walls." The kitchen stopped being just a workplace for staff. At night it smelled not only of the chef's precise dishes, but also of slightly burned pancakes the kids tried to flip themselves. Lev didn't forbid them from ruining the batter, didn't scold for extra flour on the floor. He remembered how he'd once lived terrified of every crumb so as not to give the landlord an excuse to complain. Now he marveled at how quickly the body learns to live without waiting for scolding at every sound. His own role finally slid out of the service box into the one the house sounds different without. On paper, he was still an employee, with a contract, duties, hours. In reality, any of the 5 kids who woke from a bad dream called him by name, not by job title. And when one of the boys first yelled, in the heat of an argument, that, "We have 2 dads," the silence that followed was thick enough to touch. "2 dads, huh?" the alpha said later quietly, when they were alone in the kitchen. Lev blushed and tried to object, but deep in his chest, those words had already settled like a warm stone in his hand. No documents recognized that status, but the house did. It had accepted him as a second pillar, no less important than the first. Sometimes at night Lev stepped out onto the terrace. The wind here sounded different than the wind outside his old windows. Not like a threat pushing trash and cold around the yard, but like a steady background, almost musical. Behind him, in the house, 5 children breathed in their sleep. Somewhere a computer screen still glowed in the office where the alpha worked late. On the walls, drawings hung. On the library shelves, expensive editions stood beside dog-eared kids' encyclopedias. He remembered the day he sat in a cramped kitchen, a letter with a red stamp in his hands, listening to a remote, ruthless voice over speakerphone discuss people like him as problem tenants. Then compared it to this night, to the ability to look that same voice in the eye and say there were children behind those numbers, and to the fact that the voice had changed the decision. That was where the real final chord of the story lay. Not in a perfect happy ending where no one ever yelled or slammed a door again. There were still fights. The kids could drive each other to tears. The alpha sometimes snapped. Lev grew so tired he dreamed of one day of complete silence. But above all the frayed edges of daily life lay one simple, heavy truth. There came a moment when he stopped being someone the world could dump on the street with one stroke of a pen. He became part of a structure where his words and his presence shifted the trajectory not just of one family, but of a whole building on the outskirts, and maybe of a few future decisions yet to be made. In the end, the narrator turns gently back to those who have stayed with this story. Reminds you that this is a story from BL's Story of Love. A story about how an Omega who spent years hiding his status and saving his child at any cost ended up in the house of an alpha who could have taken everything from him. And how, from that dangerous point, step by step, a family grew. A family of 5 children and 2 adults, each with their own mistakes and scars. The voice asks everyone who listened to the very end to remember which moment hit the hardest for them. The red stamp on the letter, the first step into someone else's house, the feverish night in the nursery, the confession in the office when the landlord's last name and the owner's face became one, or the day the old building stayed standing after all. It asks you to write about it in the comments, to leave a like if this story made your heart beat even a little faster, and to subscribe so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story, where love, fear, and choice will once again weave into that strange music we call life. And before saying goodbye, it reminds you of the main thing. Even if for years people have told you that you are just a troublesome tenant or an extra line in someone's report, that does not cancel your right to one day end up in a place where your voice affects decisions and where your presence changes the sound of the whole house.